On Ideas, the 1988 Massey Lectures about Media, Propaganda and Democracy. A series of 5 talks concluding tonight, divided into 16 parts and including questions from a panel of distinguished Canadian journalists. The Massey Lectures, presenting original work commissioned by the CBC from leading figures in the arts and sciences, religion and politics, have been an annual event on CBC Radio for the past 27 years. The 1988 lectures are given by Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. Professor Chomsky's internationally renowned work in the field of structural linguistics was this year awarded the prestigious Kyoto Prize, the Japanese version of the Nobel Prize, carrying a stipend of $380,000. Professor Chomsky holds 8 honorary degrees from universities around the world, and the current bibliography of his writing contains over 700 articles and 30 books. His political writing is presently focused on the function of the mass media as a propaganda system. I don't want people to believe me, he says, any more than they should believe the party line I'm criticizing, academic authority, the media, the overt state propagandists, or whatever. In talks and in print, I try to stress what I think is true, that with a little willingness to explore and use one's mind, it is possible to discover a good deal about the social and political world that is generally hidden. I feel I've achieved something if people are encouraged to take up this challenge and learn for themselves. The title of the 1988 Massey Lectures is Necessary Illusions. The phrase comes from the philosopher Reinhold Niebuhr, who concluded that ordinary people were hardly capable of understanding the world or behaving properly without being subjected to a set of what he called necessary illusions, what we'd call propaganda, constructed by the intellectual elites and conveyed by the mass media. The language of this system was parodied, or perhaps just described, by George Orwell as newspeak. Noam Chomsky's lecture tonight, The Utility of Interpretations, is in 2 sections, followed by a discussion with the journalists panel, and that's followed by some concluding remarks. The title, The Utility of Interpretations, comes from the French philosopher Pascal in his discussion of the casuists, whose task it is to conceal the truth with sophisticated argumentation and deceit. Pascal wrote about how the casuists reconcile the contradictions between their opinions and the dictates of Scripture. He records a conversation with a monk who explains that one of the ways we reconcile these contradictions is by the interpretation of some phrase. Thus, if the Gospel says you should give alms of your superfluity, and the aim is to exempt the wealthy from the obligation of almsgiving, the matter is easily put to rights by giving an interpretation to the word superfluity, so that it will seldom happen that anyone actually has to follow the command of the Gospel. Learned scholars will demonstrate that what men of the world lay up to improve their own circumstances or those of their relatives cannot really be termed superfluity, so the rich will seldom actually be obliged to give alms. There you see the utility of interpretations. Pascal's monk concludes. Concealing the truth by the interpretation of some phrase, by making words mean what is convenient for them to mean, is a project much in evidence in the contemporary elite media. The 1988 Massey Lectures by Noam Chomsky. Part 14. The Utility of Interpretations.
Last night, I discussed some of the modalities of thought control developed in democratic societies. The most effective device is the bounding of the thinkable, achieved by tolerating, even encouraging debate, though only within proper limits. But democratic systems also resort to cruder means, the method of interpretation of some phrase being a notable instrument. Thus, aggression and state terror in the Third World become defensive democracy and human rights, and democracy is successfully achieved when the government is safely in the hands of the rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations, as in Winston Churchill's prescription for world order. Under the proper interpretation of the phrase, It is indeed true that the yearning to see American-style democracy duplicated throughout the world has been a persistent theme in American foreign policy, as New York Times correspondent Neil Lewis declared. Accordingly, there is no contradiction when we yearn for democracy and independence for South Vietnam while demolishing the country to eradicate the National Liberation Front, then turning to the destruction of the politically organized Buddhists before permitting stage-managed elections. Casuistry even permits us to proceed on this course while recognizing that until they were compelled by U.S. terror to use counterforce to survive, the indigenous enemy insisted that its contest with the United States and its clients should be fought out at the political level, and that the use of massed military might was in itself illegitimate. I'm quoting U.S. government scholar Douglas Pike. Continuing to quote him, "Our rejection of politics in favor of military might is quite natural, because we recognized, as he says, that the National Liberation Front was the only truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam. With the same reasoning, it was only proper for us to subvert the first and the last free election in the history of Laos because the wrong people won, to organize or support the overthrow of elected governments in Guatemala, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, Chile, and Nicaragua, to support or directly organize large-scale terror to bar the threat of democracy and independence in Central America in the 1980s, to take strong measures to ensure that the post-war world would return to proper hands, and much else, all in what we call our yearning for democracy. From the same perspective, one can understand why, in December 1965, the New York Times editors should praise Washington for having wisely stayed in the background during the recent upheavals in Indonesia. In these recent upheavals, the Indonesian military, as they say, had defused the country's political time bomb, the powerful Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. They had done so by eliminating virtually all the top and second-level leaders of the PKI in one or another matter, and incidentally, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants, while Washington wisely observed in silence, the editors choose to believe. This concomitant of a welcome victory for freedom is not mentioned, although the editors warn that the social conditions that enabled the PKI to organize 14 million people still persist. Similarly, it is natural that the New York Times should praise the government of the Shah of Iran, restored to power by the CIA, for what they call its long record of success in defeating subversion without suppressing democracy. These subversives, now thankfully suppressed without suppressing democracy, include the pro-Soviet Tudeh Party, formerly a real menace, but now, the Times editors say, considered to have been completely liquidated, and the extreme nationalists who had been almost as subversive as the communists. And few people apparently find it jarring to read an upbeat report on what is called the return of full democracy in the Philippines, under the headline, Aquino's decree bans Communist Party. And the last paragraph explains that a presidential decree stipulated penalties of imprisonment for membership in the party, which had been legalized under the Marcos dictatorship. Not long before, Marcos himself had been a model Democrat. He was a man pledged to democracy, as Ronald Reagan explained. "We love your adherence to democratic principle and to the democratic processes, and your service to freedom," Vice President George Bush proclaimed in Manila. That, however, was before Marcos had lost control, and with it, his credentials as a freedom-loving Democrat. As we regularly discover, a solicitous concern for democracy and human rights may go hand in hand with tolerance for large-scale slaughter or even direct participation in it. The Christian Science Monitor observes accurately that after General Suharto's impressive achievement in eliminating the political threat in Indonesia by mass murder, many in the West were keen to cultivate Jakarta's new moderate leader, Suharto. In this reference, the term moderate is used with an appropriate casuistic interpretation. Suharto's subsequent achievements include extraordinary human rights violations at home and slaughter in the course of aggression in East Timor that bears comparison to Pol Pot in the same years. The Timorese slaughter was backed enthusiastically by the United States with the support of Canada, Britain, and other guardians of morality. The media cooperated by simply eliminating the issue. New York Times coverage declined as atrocities increased with U.S. participation. Times coverage reached zero at the peak of atrocities in 1978. And the few comments by its noted Southeast Asia correspondent Henry Kam assured us, on the authority of the Indonesian generals, that the army was protecting the people, fleeing from the control of the guerrillas. Scrupulously excluded was the testimony of refugees, church officials, and others who might interfere with public acquiescence in what appears to be the largest massacre relative to the population since the Holocaust. In accordance with the same principles, it's natural that vast outrage should be evoked by the terror of the Pol Pot regime, while reporters in Phnom Penh in 1973, when the U.S. bombing of populated areas of rural Cambodia had reached its peak, should carefully ignore the testimony of hundreds of thousands of refugees before their eyes. Such selective perception guarantees that little is known about the scale and character of these U.S. atrocities. These achievements of historical engineering allow the editors of the New York Times to write that when America's eyes turned away from Indochina in 1975, Cambodia's misery had just begun, with the infamous barbarities of the Khmer Rouge, then dreary occupation by Vietnam, which incidentally expelled the Khmer Rouge. Notice that the misery began in 1975, not before, and they do not remind us that during the period of so-called indifference, Washington offered indirect support to the Khmer Rouge while backing the coalition in which it was the major element because of its continuity with the Pol Pot regime, so the State Department declared. Today the press explains, I'm quoting, that the U.S. and its allies have decided that without some sign of compromise by Vietnam toward a political settlement, the Khmer Rouge forces must be allowed to serve as military pressure on Vietnam, despite their past. The phrase political settlement, of course, means political settlement on U.S. terms. An appropriate casuistic interpretation of democracy solves only half the problem. We also need a phrase for the enemies of democracy in some country where we yearn to establish or maintain it. The reflex device is to label the indigenous enemy communists, whatever their social commitments and political allegiances may be. José Napoleón Duarte and his defense minister Vides Casanova are therefore Democrats in El Salvador, defending civilization against communists, such communists as the hundreds who were murdered by the security forces as they tried to flee to Honduras across the Rio Sumpul in May 1980. They were all communist guerrillas, Duarte explained, including presumably the infant sliced to pieces with machetes. The U.S. media took the simpler path of suppressing the massacre. If the enemies of democracy are not communists, then they're terrorists. Still better, communist terrorists, or terrorists supported by international communism. The rise and decline of international terrorism in the 1980s provides much insight into the utility of interpretations. The Reagan administration deserves the credit for focusing attention on what Ronald Reagan and George Shultz call the evil scourge of terrorism, a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in the modern age. From its first days, the Reagan administration proclaimed that international terrorism would replace Carter's human rights crusade as the soul of our foreign policy. By 1985, terrorism in the Mideast Mediterranean region was selected as the top story of the year in an AP poll of editors and broadcasters, and concern reached a fever pitch in subsequent months. The U.S. bombing of Libya in April 1986 largely tamed the monster, and in the following years the plague subsided to more manageable proportions as the Soviet Union and its clients retreated in the face of American courage and determination. This is the story according to the preferred account. In fact, the rise and decline of the plague has little relation to anything happening in the world, with one exception. Its rise coincided with the need to mobilize the U.S. population to support the Reaganite commitment to state power and violence. Kremlin-directed international terrorism was a natural device for the Reaganite public relations apparatus. The problem was to frighten the domestic population sufficiently so that they would bear the costs of programs to which they were opposed, while at the same time avoiding direct confrontation with the evil empire itself. That's far too dangerous for us. The solution to the dilemma was to concoct an array of little Satans, tentacles of the great Satan, poised to destroy us, but weak and defenseless, so they can be attacked with impunity. The farce proceeded perfectly, with the cooperation of the casuists, whose task was to give a proper interpretation to the term terrorism, protecting the doctrine that its victims are primarily the democratic countries of the West. To conduct this campaign of ideological warfare, it was necessary to obscure the central role of the United States in organizing and directing state terror, and its extensive involvement in international terrorism in earlier years, as in the attack against Cuba, the prime example of the evil scourge of terrorism from the early 1960s. Some historical engineering was also required with regard to terrorism in the Middle East Mediterranean region, the primary focus of concern within the propaganda framework. Here it was necessary to suppress the leading role of the United States and its Israeli client. These tasks were well within the capacity of the media and the terrorologists. With appropriate interpretations, then, we can rest content that the United States and its clients defend democracy, social reform, and self-determination against communists and terrorists of all kinds. It is the responsibility of the media to laud the Democrats and demonize the official enemy, the Sandinistas, the PLO, or whoever gets in the way. Sometimes this requires some fancy footwork, but the challenge has generally been successfully met.
The 1988 CBC Massey Lectures continue on Ideas, presented by Noam Chomsky. Part 15. Peace, Democracy, and Freedom of the Press.
Our yearning for democracy is accompanied by a no less profound yearning for peace, and the media also face the task of historical engineering to establish this required truth. We therefore have phenomena called peace missions and the peace process. These are terms that apply to whatever the United States happens to be doing or advocating at some moment. A headline in the Los Angeles Times in January 1988 reads as follows: Latin Peace Trip by Schultz planned. The subheading describes the contents of the peace trip. Mission would be last-ditch effort to defuse opposition on Contra-aid. The article quotes administration officials who describe the peace mission as the only way to save Contra-aid in the face of growing congressional opposition. In plain English, the peace mission is a last-ditch effort to block peace and to mobilize Congress for what the World Court called the unlawful use of force, now that Washington and its loyal media had succeeded in completely dismantling the unwanted Central American peace plan. A few months later, the New York Times reported further efforts by the administration, in their words, to keep pressure on the Sandinistas by continuing to provide support for the Contras, including more military aid, while urging U.S. allies to join the United States in efforts to isolate Nicaragua diplomatically and revive the peace process. The Los Angeles Times described these renewed administration efforts to build support for the resumption of U.S. military aid to Nicaragua's Contras under the headline, Schultz will try to revive Latin peace process. In short, war is peace. The task of historical engineering has been accomplished with no less efficiency in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The problem has been to present the United States and its Israeli client as yearning for peace and pursuing the peace process, while in fact, since the early 1970s, they have led the rejectionist camp and have been blocking peace initiatives that have had broad international and regional support. The technique has been the usual one. The peace process is, by definition, whatever the United States proposes. The desired conclusion now follows, whatever the facts. U.S. policy is also by definition moderate, so that those who oppose it are extremist and uncompromising. Reinhold Niebuhr once remarked that perhaps the most significant moral characteristic of a nation is its hypocrisy. The point is well taken. There's a simple measure of hypocrisy, which we very properly apply to our enemies. When peace groups, government figures, media, and loyal intellectuals in the Soviet sphere deplore brutal and repressive acts of the United States and its clients, we test their sincerity by asking what they say about their own responsibilities. Minimal honesty requires that we apply the same standards to ourselves. Freedom of the press, for example, is a prime concern for the media and the intellectual community. No crime of the Sandinistas has elicited more outrage than their censorship of La Prensa and its suspension in 1986, immediately after Congress responded to the World Court decision by voting new aid to the Contras, a virtual declaration of war as the Reaganites happily proclaimed. La Prensa publisher Violeta Chamorro was at once given an award by the Nieman Journalism Foundation at Harvard for her courageous battle for freedom of speech. In the New York Review of Books, Murray Kempton appealed to all those committed to free expression to provide financial aid for the brave struggle of the editors to maintain their staff and equipment. Such gifts would supplement the funding provided by the U.S. government from shortly after the Sandinista victory, when President Carter authorized the CIA to secretly support La Prensa and the anti-Sandinista opposition. Under the heading, A Newspaper of Valor, the Washington Post lauded Violeta Chamorro, commenting that she and her newspaper deserved 10 awards. Other media commentary has been no less effusive, while the Sandinistas have been bitterly condemned for harassing this tribune of the people. We now ask whether these sentiments reflect libertarian values or service to power, applying the standard test of sincerity. How, for example, did the same people and institutions react when the independent media in El Salvador were eliminated by the security forces of the Duarte government that we support, not by intermittent censorship and suspension, but by murder, mutilation, and physical destruction? We have already seen the answer. There was silence. The New York Times has had nothing to say, and others are no different. To test this conclusion further, we may turn to Guatemala. No censorship was required, while the United States was supporting the terror at its height. The murder of dozens of journalists sufficed. There was little notice in the United States. With the democratic renewal that we proudly hail, little has changed. In February 1988, the center-left weekly La Época began to publish Testing Guatemalan Democracy. On June 10th, 15 heavily armed men firebombed the offices, destroying them and kidnapping the night watchman. Eyewitness testimony and other sources leave little doubt that it was an operation of the Guatemalan security forces. The editor held a press conference on June the 14th to announce that the journal would have to shut down because there are not conditions in the country to guarantee the exercise of free and independent journalism. The next day he left the country, returning to exile, accompanied to the airport by a Western diplomat to see that he got there without being murdered. The destruction of La Época signaled not only the end of an independent media voice in Guatemala, but it served as a warning as well that future press independence would not be tolerated by the government or security forces, so the human rights group America's Watch commented. These facts were not reported in the New York Times or Washington Post, though not from ignorance, surely. It is simply that the matter is unimportant. A few weeks later, Israeli security forces raided the offices of the leading Jerusalem daily Al Fajr, arresting its managing editor, Hatem Abdelkader, and jailing him for 6 months without trial and on specified security grounds. There were no ringing editorial denunciations or calls for retribution. In fact, these trivialities were not even reported in the New York Times or Washington Post. Unlike Violeta Chamorro, to whom nothing of the sort has happened, Abdelkader does not deserve 10 awards, or even 1, or even a line. The extent of the hypocrisy becomes still more obvious when we consider what the Washington Post called the newspaper of valor more closely. La Prensa quite openly supports the attack against Nicaragua. In April 1986, as the campaign to provide military aid to the Contras was heating up, one of the owners wrote an op-ed column in the Washington Post in which he called for aid to those Nicaraguans who are fighting for democracy. That's the standard reference to the U.S. proxy forces. In the weeks preceding the summer congressional vote, a host of articles by 5 different La Prensa staff members denounced the Sandinistas in major newspapers throughout the United States. This included a series of op-eds signed by top La Prensa editors in the Washington Post as they traveled to the United States under the auspices of front organizations of the Contra-funding network run by Oliver North. La Prensa barely pretends to be a newspaper in the Western sense. It's a propaganda journal devoted to undermining the government and supporting the attack against Nicaragua by a foreign power. Since its reopening in October 1987, the commitments are quite open and transparent. There is no precedent for the survival and continued publication of such a journal during a period of crisis, to my knowledge, in any Western democracy, surely not the United States. It might be argued that comparison with the United States is inadequate and unfair, given the dismal U.S. record. We might take that to be the import of remarks by Supreme Court Justice William Brennan in a speech that he delivered at Hebrew University Law School in December 1987. In this speech, he observed that the United States has a long history of failing to preserve civil liberties when it perceived its national security threatened. He went on to say that it may well be Israel, not the United States, that provides the best hope for building a jurisprudence that can protect civil liberties against the demands of national security. And he added that the nations of the world, faced with sudden threats to their own security, will look to Israel's experience in handling its continuing security crisis, and they may well find in that experience the expertise to reject the security claims that Israel has exposed as baseless, and the courage to preserve the civil liberties that Israel has preserved without detriment to its security. If we can draw lessons from Israel's stellar record, adversity may yet be the handmaiden of liberty, he concluded. Well, following the precepts of this characteristic accolade, we derive a further test of the sincerity of those who denounce the totalitarian Sandinistas. Just at the time that La Prensa was suspended in 1986, after the virtual declaration of war by Congress, Israel permanently closed 2 Jerusalem newspapers. The grounds were that, I'm quoting, although we offer them freedom of expression, it is forbidden to permit them to exploit this freedom in order to harm the State of Israel. The Interior Ministry declared that it was compelled to act in the interest of state security and public welfare. We believe in freedom of the press, the ministry asserted, but one has to properly balance freedom of expression and the welfare of the state. The closure was upheld by the High Court on the grounds that it is inconceivable that the State of Israel should allow terrorist organizations which seek to destroy it to set up businesses in its territory, legitimate as they may be. The government had accused these 2 Arab newspapers of receiving support from hostile groups. As La Prensa was reopened in 1987, the Israeli press reported the closing of a political journal in Nazareth on grounds of its extreme nationalist editorial line. An Arab-owned news office in Nablus was shut down on the charge of support for the PLO. The Israeli High Court upheld the closing of the Nazareth Journal, alleging that the security services had provided evidence of a connection between the journal and terrorist organizations. The court dismissed as irrelevant the plea of the publisher that everything that had appeared in the journal had passed through Israeli censorship. None of this was reported. New York Times correspondent Thomas Friedman chose the day of the closing of the Nablus office to produce one of his regular odes to freedom of expression in Israel. There was no outcry of protest among American civil libertarians, no denunciation or even comment on acts that far exceed the harassment and temporary suspension of the U.S.-funded journal in Nicaragua that openly supports the overthrow of the government. Once again, history has contrived a controlled experiment to demonstrate the utter contempt for freedom of speech on the part of professed civil libertarians. In the United States, one will discover very little reference to the severe constraints on free expression in Israel over many years. It was not until the violent reaction to the Palestinian uprising from December 1987 that even cursory notice was taken of these practices. In the New York Times, there had been virtually nothing. It requires considerable audacity for former chief editor A.M. Rosenthal to assert in May 1988 that censorship in Israel deserves and gets Western criticism. Furthermore, the rare exceptions to the general silence on these matters do not lead to condemnations for these departures from our high ideals, and they do not lead to a call for some action on the part of Israel's leading patron. The reaction of the U.S. media and the American intellectual community to Israeli law and practices provides further dramatic evidence that the show of concern for civil liberties and human rights in Nicaragua is cynical pretense serving other ends.
Noam Chomsky will be back at the end of tonight's program with some concluding remarks to these 1988 CBC Massey lectures. Several weeks ago, Professor Chomsky talked to an audience at Ryerson Polytechnical Institute in Toronto on the subject of media, propaganda, and democracy. Afterwards, he was questioned by a panel of Canadian journalists, and we've been presenting parts of that public discussion this week. This is reporter and filmmaker Kevin McMahon.
It's my impression that most of the population feels that it's being propagandized, and they turn more and more towards using media as strictly a source of entertainment. You know, it's a postman idea about it doesn't really matter what they say because they say it so stupidly that you know, people are just consuming it for a laugh. And I wonder if now that doesn't become more of a problem really than propaganda. I mean, despite the really impressive evidence that you amass, I don't think most people would be convinced by a couple of sentences saying we're propagandized. And so, yeah, I wonder if entertainment isn't really the greater problem now.
Yeah, I think what you said is very important. What I've been talking about gives a kind of a skewed picture. I maybe should have emphasized more, but remember, I'm talking about the elite media. The elite media target largely educated people. They target the political class, the more or less politically active class, a pretty small percentage of the population, the articulate elite intellectuals. And that's the kind of propaganda I've been talking about, and that's only a small part of the system. Things have to be done for the rest of the population, too. They have to be marginalized, but they're not going to be marginalized by telling them lies about foreign policy, because just as you say, they don't believe most of what they read. There's just a kind of a general populist skepticism, along with this sense that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, is the sense that the media are probably lying to us. So for most of the population, the media system is, I think, a different one. It's not just the case that it tries to entertain them. It tries to entertain them through means which will intensify attitudes that support the interests of elites. So you want, for example, let me give some cases. Take the emphasis on professional sports. Now, it sounds harmless, but it really isn't. Professional sports are a way of building up jingoist fanaticism. You're supposed to cheer for your own team. Just to mention something from personal experience, I remember very well myself when I was, I guess, a high school student, sudden revelation, when I asked myself, why am I cheering for my high school football team? I don't know anybody on it. If I met anybody on it, I'd probably hate each other. Why do I care whether they win or if some guy a couple blocks away wins? Well, and then you can say the same thing about, the baseball team or whatever else it is. This idea of cheering for your home team, which you mentioned before, that's a way of building into people irrational submissiveness to power, and it's a very dangerous thing. And I think that's one of the reasons it's such a big, it gets such a huge play. Let's move to something else. The indoctrination that's done by TV and so on is not trying to pile up evidence and give arguments and so on. It's trying to inculcate attitudes. I mentioned a couple of cases, but there are a lot more. Let's take, say, the bombing of Libya. Why did the American public support the bombing of Libya? Well, the reason is that there had been a very effective and careful and intense inculcation of racist attitudes about Arabs. I mean, anti-Arab racism is the one form of racism in the United States that's considered legitimate. I mean, plenty of people are racists, but you don't like to admit it. On the other hand, with regard to anti-Arab racism, we admit it openly. I mean, you read a journal like, say, the New Republic, and the kinds of things that they say about Arabs, if anybody said them about Jews, you'd think you're reading Der Stürmer. You know, I'm not joking. And nobody notices it, you know, because Arab anti-racism is so profound. It shows up in literature. I mean, there are novels that have a form of anti-Arab racism that's hair-raising. You know, same is true of television shows and so on and so forth. An image has been created throughout a lot of the media are part of this, not all, you know, the Arab terrorist lurking out there ready to kill us. And against that background, you could bomb Libya and people would cheer. Recall how effective that was. Remember what was happening in 1986. There are a lot of measures of how effective this is. Remember that in 1986, when this happened, the tourism industry in Europe was virtually wiped out because Americans were afraid to go to Europe, where incidentally, objectively, they would be about 100 times as safe as in any American city. That's no joke. But they were afraid to go to Europe because they got these Arab terrorists out there trying to kill us, you know? Now, that was not from New York Times editorials. That was from a whole array of television and novels and soap operas and, you know, massive symbolism and so on and so forth. And that's effective. I mean, that's, the anti-communist hysteria is developed that way too. The communists are out there ready to kill us. Who are the communists? I don't know, you know. They're out there ready to kill us. You know, this is introduced by the kinds of symbolism that TV is good at and cheap novels are good at and so on. And that's important. You know, these are critical means of indoctrination. It's just that I wasn't talking about them. I was talking about the more intellectual side.
Noam Chomsky, who continues now with his concluding remarks in the 1988 CBC Messy Lectures about media, propaganda, and democracy.
Discussing what he called our unfree press half a century ago, John Dewey observed that criticism of specific abuses has only limited value. He wrote that the only really fundamental approach to the problem is to inquire concerning the necessary effect of the present economic system upon the whole system of publicity, upon the judgment of what news is, upon the selection and elimination of matter that is published, upon the treatment of news in both editorial and news columns. The question, under this mode of approach, is not how many specific abuses there are and how they may be remedied, but how far genuine intellectual freedom and social responsibility are possible on any large scale under the existing economic regime. Publishers and editors, with their commitments to the public and social order of which they are the beneficiaries, will often prove to be among the chief enemies of true liberty of the press, Dewey continued. They are among the leaders and the henchmen of big business, and they will select and treat their special wares from this standpoint. Insofar as the ideological managers are giving the public what it wants, that is because of the effect of the present economic system in generating intellectual indifference and apathy, in creating a demand for distraction and diversion among a public that is debauched by the ideal of getting away with whatever it can. All of these are Dewey's words. To these apt reflections, we may add the intimate relations between private and state power, the institutionally determined need to accommodate to the interests of those who control basic social decisions, and the success of established power in steadily disintegrating any independent culture, fostering values other than greed, personal gain, and subordination to authority, and any popular forms that sustain independent thought and action. Within the reigning social order, the general public must remain an object of manipulation, not a participant in thought, debate, and decision. I have discussed some of the ways these principles have been expressed in the modern period, but the concerns are natural and have arisen from the very origins of the democratic thrust. Condemning the radical Democrats who had threatened to turn the world upside down during the English Revolution of the 17th century, historian Clement Walker in 1661 complained that they have cast all the mysteries and secrets of government before the vulgar, like pearls before swine, and have taught both the soldiery and the people to look so far into them as to ravel back all governments to the first principles of nature. They have made the people thereby so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule. Walker's concerns were soon overcome, as an orderly world was restored and the political defeat of the Democrats was total and irreversible, as historian Christopher Hill observes. By 1695, censorship could be abandoned, not on the radicals' libertarian principles, but because censorship was no longer necessary, for the opinion formers now censored themselves, and nothing got into print which frightened the men of property. Again, quoting Christopher Hill. In the same year, 1695, John Locke wrote that day laborers and tradesmen, the spinsters and dairymaids, must be told what to believe. The greatest part cannot know, and therefore they must believe. With the decline of religious authority in the modern period, the task has fallen to the secular priesthood, who understand their responsibility with some clarity, as I have already discussed. The manipulation of the public in the 1960s elicited the concerns expressed by Senator Fulbright that I quoted last night when he described the media as adjuncts of government. A year later, law professor Jerome Barron proposed what he called an interpretation of the First Amendment, which focuses on the idea that restraining the hand of government is quite useless in assuring free speech if a restraint on access is effectively secured by private groups that alone can lay sentiments before the public. As a constitutional theory for the communication of ideas, laissez-faire is manifestly irrelevant, he said, when the media are narrowly controlled by private power. In reality, only those media that consistently restrict both sides to the narrow spectrum of elite consensus will succeed in the guided free market. It is particularly important to understand what stories not to seek. Refugees from Timor or from U.S. bombing in Laos and Cambodia have no useful tales to tell. It is important to stay away from camps on the Honduran border, where refugees will report the atrocities of the forces we organize, train, and supply. It would be bad form to arouse public awareness of Nicaragua's noteworthy progress in the social sector, which is laying a solid foundation for long-term socioeconomic development. I'm quoting the words of the Inter-American Development Bank in 1983, before it was barred by U.S. pressure from contributing to these achievements. In contrast, it is responsible journalism for James Lemoyne of the New York Times to denounce the Sandinistas for the bitterness and apathy that he sees in Managua. Those who hope to enter the system must learn that terror traceable to the PLO, Gaddafi, or Khomeini leaves worthy victims who arouse care and concern, but those targeted by the United States and its allies do not fall within this category. Responsible journalists must understand that a grenade attack on Israeli army recruits and their families, leaving one killed and many wounded, deserves a front-page photograph in the New York Times and a substantial story, while a Contra-attack on a passenger bus the day before, with 2 killed, 2 kidnapped, and many wounded, merits no report at all. Category by category, the same lessons hold. Throughout these lectures, I have been discussing some of the means of thought control and the reasons why these measures gain such prominence in democratic systems in which the general population cannot be driven from the political arena by force. The discussion may leave the impression that the system is all-powerful, but that is very far from true. People have significant capacities to resist, and sometimes do, with great effect. Take the case of the Western-backed slaughter in Timor. The media suppressed the terrible events and the complicity of their own governments, but the story nevertheless did finally break through, reaching segments of the public and even Congress. This was the achievement of a few dedicated young people, literally about half a dozen, people whose names will not be known to history, as is generally true of significant actors who have changed the world. Their efforts did not bring an end to the Indonesian terror, or the Western support for it, but these efforts did mitigate the violence. Finally, as a result of their work, the Red Cross was allowed limited access, and in this and other ways, tens of thousands of lives were saved. There are very few people in the world who can claim to have achieved so much of human consequence, and the same is true of many other cases. The United States is a much more civilized and decent place than it was 25 years ago. The crisis of democracy that so terrifies elites is very real, and the effects on the society have been profound and extremely healthy with regard to a wide range of issues: racism, environmental concerns, feminism, intervention, and much else. There was no protest when John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to attack the rural society of South Vietnam. In contrast, Ronald Reagan was driven underground to clandestine terror in Central America. The climate of opinion and concern had changed outside of elite circles, and the capacity of the state to exercise violence has been correspondingly reduced. The toll of Reaganite terror has been awesome. Tens of thousands of tortured and mutilated bodies, massive starvation and disease and destruction, hundreds of thousands of refugees, and much else. It would have been a great deal worse without the constraints imposed by an aroused population which had found ways to escape the system of indoctrination and had found the courage and the honesty to act. These are no small achievements, again on the part of people whose names will be lost to history. There are ample opportunities to create a more humane and decent world if we choose to use them. I began these lectures with the questions raised by the Brazilian bishops about the problems of democracy and the media. Perhaps I may close with my own conclusions about these matters. The professed concern for freedom of the press in the West is not very persuasive in the light of the very easy dismissal of even extreme violations of press freedom in U.S. client states and the actual performance of the media in serving the powerful and privileged as an agency of manipulation, indoctrination, and control. A democratic communications policy, in contrast, would seek to develop means of expression and interaction that reflect the interests and concerns of the general population, and to encourage their self-education and individual and collective action. A policy conceived in these terms would be a worthwhile goal, though there are pitfalls and dangers that should not be overlooked. But the issue is largely academic, viewed in isolation from the general social scene. A democratic communications policy can be approached only as an integral part of the further democratization of the social order, dissolving the concentration of decision-making power in the state-corporate nexus. Such a conception of democracy, though so familiar from earlier years that it might even merit the much-abused term conservative, is remote from those conceptions that dominate public discourse, hardly a surprise given its threat to established privilege. Human beings are the only species with a history. Whether we also have a future is not so obvious. The answer to the question will lie in the prospects for popular movements dedicated to values that are driven to the margins within the existing social order, the values of community, solidarity, concern for a fragile environment that will have to sustain future generations, creative work under voluntary control, independent thought, and true democratic participation in every aspect of our social, economic, and political life.
The 1988 Massey Lectures by Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. Professor Chomsky has written 30 books in the areas of structural linguistics and political philosophy. His most recent book, with co-author Edward Herman, is about the political economy of the mass media. It's called Manufacturing Consent, and it's in bookstores and libraries now. If you'd like a reading list of books and articles by and about Noam Chomsky, please write to us. We'd also like to know what you thought about this year's Massey Lectures. Our address is Ideas, Box 500, Station A, Toronto M5W1E6. The Massey Lectures were produced for Ideas by Max Allen, with Lorne Tult, Brian Hickey, and Ken Mackay and Bob Lackey. The Ryerson panel was moderated by Stuart McLean, with Peter Worthington, David Frum, Margaret Daly, Jean Allen, and Kevin McMahon. I'm Lister Sinclair.